Good morning, and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference, titled Toxic Hazards in Everyday Products, the latest science on exposures and adverse health effects associated with flame retardant chemicals. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment, and CHE Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. We have held well over 120 calls. We might even be up to 150 teleconferences by now, all seminars that can be found on our website at akaction.org as we record our calls each time. You can find more information at akaction.org and healthandenvironment.org. We're joined today by Dr. Kate Hoffman of Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment, and Jeff Gearhart, Research Director for Ecology Center's healthystuff.org. Both of our speakers have presentation slides, which you will need to download if you haven't done so already. I sent a link to the PDFs yesterday to everyone who had signed up for the call. If you signed up today, please go to ACAT's homepage at akaction.org. You will see the links to the presentation documents beneath the title of today's call. And keep in mind that this is an audio-only teleconference rather than a webinar, so you will need to click through the document yourself to follow along. Our call will last an hour, and during the last 10 minutes, we will have time for participant questions and discussion. And now it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome Dr. Kate Hoffman. Dr. Hoffman is an assistant research professor at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. Her research is focused on understanding the impact of environmental chemical exposures on children's growth and development. As a doctoral student at Boston University, Kate investigated associations between perfluoroalkyl chemicals and children's cognitive and behavioral development. During her postdoctoral work, she shifted her focus to flame retardant exposures and came to Duke University in 2014 to work in the Stapleton lab. Her current projects include an assessment of children's exposure to flame retardant chemicals and an investigation of the impacts of exposure on early immune system development and function. Dr. Hoffman was awarded the 2018 Joan M. Daisy Outstanding Young Scientist Award by the International Society of Exposure Science for her contributions to the science of human exposure. And we're so happy to have you with us today, Dr. Hoffman, as Anchorage is considering an ordinance to protect children and firefighters, the health of children and firefighters from the harmful flame retardant chemicals. So it's wonderful to be able to hear from someone on the front lines of doing the important research that tells us about the health effects. So welcome, Kate. You may go ahead and begin.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody, and thanks for calling in and the opportunity to be here. Today, I'm going to be talking about some work that we've done over the last couple of years looking at perinatal exposure to flame retardant chemicals and its impact on children's growth and development. I am currently on slide 2, and I'll try to remember to let you know as I move through the slides, but just in case I forget, I'll kind of periodically check back at that, and I do have slide numbers in the bottom corner of each slide. So I suspect that a lot of you already know quite a lot about flame retardant chemicals. Flame retardants are added to many consumer products to comply with fire safety regulations, and these include products from sort of a number of different categories. Polyurethane foam is certainly something that has flame retardant chemicals added to it, and this is the polyurethane foam used to make furniture, the cushions in furniture. It's also used in carpet padding. And in some children's products, so things like play mats, anything that has foam inside, so also potentially car seats. Flame retardants are also used in electronics, and they're used in construction material applications as well. And I'll just note that a number of these chemicals that we refer to as flame retardants also have other uses, including as plasticizers. So we think that flame retardant use has increased dramatically over the last several decades, and there are sort of two common classes of flame retardants that we hear a lot about, and those include the brominated flame retardants, so the polybrominated diphenyl ethers, or PBDEs, which have been largely phased out in the United States at this point due to concerns over their environmental persistence and also potential health effect concerns. There are also other brominated flame retardants like TBB, which is used in the Firemaster 550 flame retardant mixture. And there's sort of this other class that we refer to broadly as the organophosphate flame retardants, and that's sort of the class of flame retardants that I'll be speaking most about today. They include compounds like TDCI-PP or chlorinated tris and triphenyl phosphate. And so these organophosphate flame retardants have a lot in common with other flame retardants in terms of the way they're used. So these products, or these flame retardants, are generally sprayed on products, and they're not chemically bound to those products. So over time, they sort of leach out into the environment and into the sort of dust and air in your home. So as you sort of sit on your couch or have your TV on, these chemicals volatilize or make their way out into your home environment. And they've certainly been detected broadly in indoor air and dust samples from homes and offices and schools and cars. So they're really widespread in the environment. And because of that, human exposure to these compounds is also extremely widespread. I've included a couple structures here just because I'm sort of in a chemistry realm now, but this is just sort of what these compounds look like here on slide 3. So moving to slide 4, I'm going to be talking specifically about 3 organophosphate flame retardants today. I'm going to be talking about TDCI-PP, triphenyl phosphate, and the isopropylated triaryl phosphates. And I've just sort of included this is the parent compound, and this is the urinary biomarker that we use for monitoring these compounds in the population. So I'll be talking a lot about BDCI-PP, DPHP, or diphenyl phosphate, and perhaps the worst named acronym ever, IPPP. So moving on to slide 5. As I mentioned, metabolites of the organophosphate flame retardants are detected really broadly in the U.S. population and other populations as well, and that means in the general population. These compounds are certainly detected in greater than 90% of urine samples from the average American, and the levels appear to be increasing over time. So that's what this figure here shows. We have the year that samples were collected and the urinary BDCI-PP concentration. And these dots each represent the geometric mean or average from an individual study. So there's a lot more data than this going into this figure, but these are sort of 21 different studies. And as you can see, the levels seem to be increasing from about 2002, which is when our first study was conducted, through 2016 in this figure. And in fact, the levels of BDCI-PP are predicted to be 16 times higher between 2002 and 2015 based on data from this figure. And you'll note that a lot of this data is from North America, and I'll just mention that all of the North American studies were analyzed, all of these urine samples were analyzed in the lab of Heather Stapleton. So this is not just sort of a trend that we're seeing where different laboratories are sort of entering this field of monitoring this compound. It seems to be there's some real potential increases going on. Moving to slide 6. We also think that children tend to have higher levels of exposure to these compounds as evidenced by higher levels of the biomarkers of exposure in urine samples. So this first panel is from a paper by Butt et al. From 2014, where they looked at mothers and their children living in the same homes, and they looked at the levels of these urinary metabolites of flame retardant exposure. And you can see for each of these metabolites, the children certainly had higher levels of exposure than their mothers. And then the second panel is from Van den Eede et al., and they looked at, in the Australian population, they took pooled samples from people of different ages, and you can see here they also see sort of this decreasing trend with age, where young children tend to have higher levels of exposure than older populations. I'm on slide 7. So in terms of factors that we think are related to exposures to these compounds or the levels of biomarkers in urine samples, one of, I think, sort of the more interesting things that we see is there does seem to be this sort of seasonal pattern in exposure. The data in this figure is from 350 women from North Carolina, and we're displaying on the horizontal axis the BDCI-PP concentration in urine. And you can see each green dot represents an individual woman, and so in summer months, there's sort of this average higher level of these compounds in urine compared to winter months. And I've also sort of overlaid on this figure the average temperature in degrees Celsius, and that's what this gray line here is. So when temperature is low, we tend to see lower levels of these compounds in urine. And that's something that we don't really understand why that's taking place. We're certainly very interested in exposure to these compounds in cars, and have thought, because this is a North Carolina population, in the summer our cars get really hot. And so what we thought is maybe that these compounds are used in cars, and there's sort of an increased level of exposure that's associated with that. And that's sort of something we're still following up on to see what might be driving this trend, but it's certainly something that's important for epidemiologic studies to consider moving forward. Next slide. We also see some associations between the levels of these compounds in urine and body mass index, so that people with higher, people that are overweight or obese tend to have higher levels of these compounds in their urine, particularly for the IPPPP, so it's about 50% higher in individuals that are obese compared to those that are normal weight. And that pattern, although it's not statistically significant in all cases, seems to persist over all three of these particular PFR metabolites. I'm on slide 9. Certainly, evidence of health impacts in humans for PFR exposure is increasing pretty rapidly. Some PFRs are considered probable human carcinogens, and data suggests that they're also associated with endocrine function. So higher levels of TDC, IPP in house dust, for example, have been associated with altered thyroid hormone levels in men, and also different reproductive health endpoints. And the same thing has been shown for the triphenyl phosphate metabolite among both men and women. And I'll just say that the human health side of this is certainly an area that's increasing extremely rapidly right now. We're seeing more and more studies in this area. Just a little more background specifically looking at growth, because that's what I'll be talking about today. Both in chicken embryos and in rodents, we do see evidence of decreased rate of hatching or lower weights in lower birth weights following prenatal exposure. And there's certainly some evidence based on data from Heather Patesol's group looking at both gestational and lactational exposure to Firemaster 550 and showing that that's associated with later life obesity. So moving to slide 11. I'll just say that sort of based on the prior animal data, there's certainly evidence that these organophosphate flame retardants could impact growth. We think that's particularly important in early life. And based on these data, we sort of set out on an investigation of whether in a human population we would see that higher levels of exposure altered fetal growth or impacted the risk for obesity in early childhood. And as sort of a sub-aim of that, we were really interested in what might be driving changes in birth weight, and we began to look into altered gestational duration and the risk of preterm birth in this population. And I'll just say that this work has actually been published in Environments International. I've included a little picture of the paper here, but if anyone has any trouble finding it, please let me know and I'd be happy to send you a copy. On to slide 12. So low birth weight and preterm birth are extremely important health outcomes in that they're associated with a number of different adverse health conditions in infancy, but they also have lifelong impacts, and they've been linked to a number of different health outcomes, including greater risk of obesity and increased risk of some cancers later in life. So these are certainly important health impacts for lifelong health. A baby is considered a low birth weight baby if they're born below about 5.5 pounds. And in the United States, we have about 1 in 12 babies that are born below birth weight. There's certainly a lot of causes of a low birth weight baby, and those include both the restriction of growth in utero, but also being born preterm. So if you're born too early, you're also likely to be born too small. So a preterm birth is a birth that happens before 37 weeks of pregnancy, and it's estimated there are about 15 million preterm births per year. In the United States, 10% of babies are born preterm, and it's a huge cost associated with these births. So this data is a little bit old from 2005, but the estimated cost at that point was $26.2 billion estimated costs from just the healthcare for moms and babies that are born preterm. So I would imagine that this number has certainly increased. And if you consider sort of all these lifelong health effects, it's probably a much more substantial impact. I move now to slide 13. To evaluate whether these exposures to these organophosphate flame retardants are associated with these birth outcomes, we are using data from the Pregnancy, Infection, and Nutrition Study, or PIN. PIN is a pregnancy cohort study, and it was run from 2002 to 2005 and recruited pregnant women from UNC prenatal care clinics. And when these women were sort of between their second and third trimester of pregnancy, they provided a urine sample, and in that urine sample, we measured biomarkers of exposure to the organophosphate flame retardants. Women also completed demographic surveys, and we recorded birth outcomes from their medical records. So we recorded the weight at birth and how many weeks pregnant the woman was when she delivered the baby. And for the kids in the PIN study, we also have measurements of their height and weight from each doctor's visit from birth until the kid was 3 years old. I'm on slide 14, and this just summarizes the characteristics of this population. Women in the PIN study ranged from 17 to 46 years old when they had their babies. Tends to be a really highly educated cohort, with about 70% of the participants in the study having graduated from college before they became pregnant. And it's not a particularly diverse cohort, with about 80% of women in the PIN study reporting they had Caucasian race. On slide 15, you can see the distribution of urinary PFR metabolite levels. I'm showing them here for BDC, IPP, DPHP, and IPPPP, and what you'll notice about these is they were detected really frequently in this population. So BDC, IPP was detected in 93% of the urine samples from these women. And I'll just mention that, these urine samples were collected between 2002 and 2005. And while we sometimes think of these organophosphate flame retardants as being sort of novel and new and replacement products for the PBDE flame retardants, we actually were seeing pretty high detection frequency, even at a time when the PBDE flame retardant mixtures were used much more commonly. So this suggests to us that these compounds have actually been used for quite some time. Among these women, the geometric mean concentration or average in their urine was about 1.8 nanograms per milliliter. And you can see there was considerable variation, with one woman having 140 nanograms per milliliter in her urine sample. I'm on slide 16. We had 347 children with birth weight information available, and those babies were all born between 1,400 and 4,800 grams, and they had sort of an average birth weight of about 7.25 pounds. 23 infants in this cohort were born low birth weight, and that's about 6.9%, so somewhat lower than what you would expect to see in the general U.S. population. On slide 17, you can see the associations between PFR exposure and birth weight in this cohort. And I'll sort of orient you to the slide here. So for each metabolite, we divided the concentrations into quartiles. So this Q1, 2, 3, 4 would represent low to high exposure, with high being Q4. And we saw some sort of interesting differences between males and females here. So I'm presenting the analyses stratified based on the sex of the infant. And I think the most interesting part of this slide is sort of down here for IPPPP. And what you can see here is that baby girls born with the highest levels of prenatal exposure to IPPPP were born an average of 331 grams smaller than baby girls with the lowest levels of exposure. And so this is a pretty substantial difference. It's about 3/4 pound difference in the group with the highest levels of exposure on average. We weren't able to look at whether or not this particular exposure was associated with the odds of being a low birth weight baby, simply because we only had 23 low birth weight babies in this cohort. And since we were interested in looking at this potential difference between males and females, we didn't have a whole lot of babies to look at clinical preterm birth. Mm-hmm. So slide 18 summarizes the distribution of gestational duration at birth in this cohort. You can see that babies were born between 29 and 42 weeks gestation, with an average gestation of 39 weeks. I'll just remind everyone that 40 weeks is the length of a typical pregnancy, so we're pretty close to that here. And in this population, 43 infants were born preterm, which is about what you would expect in the U.S. population. On slide 19, you can see the odds ratios for preterm birth, and what you can see here is this is the effect in the highest exposure group. So baby girls born with the highest levels of exposure to IPPPP and BDC IPP were about 4 times as likely to be a preterm birth. So there's some evidence here that this is causing a shorter gestational duration in girls. And in baby boys, we actually see the opposite trend, which is something that's really interesting to us, and we're still sort of trying to make sense of what might be driving this difference between boys and girls. I think it's certainly an interesting thing. I think it's certainly concerning to be born too early, but there are also certainly health effects with being born too late. Moving to, I guess I'll just say about slide 19. So what this really tells us, I've had to cut out some additional slides here, but what this pattern sort of tells us is that the impact that we're seeing for birth weight is very likely driven by this shorter gestation. So yes, baby girls are born lighter. What that's telling us with this gestational age data is that the reason that they're born lighter may be that they're born earlier, rather than sort of indicating a restriction of growth in utero. So now moving to slide 20, where we were really interested in this cohort to see if these effects persisted over time, and what happened to the growth of these children as they got older. So as I mentioned, every time kids in the PEN study went to the doctor's office, their height and weight was recorded, and we received that information back. So we ended up with 2,800 measurements of growth on these kids. And as you can see, they were sort of clustered here when the kids were younger, because you go to the doctor more frequently when you're younger. So we had a lot of information when these kids were sort of between 0 and 1 year old, when you're going to the doctor every month or every 2 months, and a little bit less information as they got older, but still at least one measurement of growth for all of these kids at about 3 years old. And we use these measurements of height and weight to calculate age and sex-specific BMI percentile. So how do you compare to other 3-year-olds? Are you, this is that, are you at the 50th percentile or 70th percentile type of calculation? So slide 21 kind of sums up what we found with this. In general, I'll just say that we didn't really see huge impacts of prenatal exposure to these compounds on kids' growth. And this, I'm presenting here sort of one possible exception. With the IPPPP compound, or IPPPP metabolite, baby boys who had the highest levels of prenatal exposure to that compound appeared to grow more rapidly and become bigger than their peers by age 2 to 3. And girls, you can remember that they were born smaller than their peers, and they tended to sort of catch up, but didn't really have this overshoot where they were by the end of the study or by the age 3. They didn't seem to be bigger than their peers. And we didn't really see associations for other organophosphate flame retardants exposure prenatally and their associations with this later life growth. And so that really got us thinking about what might be going on here and what might explain this pattern. And one thing that's really important to keep in mind, as I've already mentioned, we know that kids have potentially higher levels of exposure to these compounds. So slide 22 is sort of an example of some work that we've been doing looking at infants' exposure and young children's exposure to these compounds. We've actually, this paper is a little bit older now. I think it's from maybe 2015, but I include it in presentations anytime I can because this is actually a picture of my daughter on the slide. And she's 4 now, and she's very impressed and thinks that she actually wrote this article, and she tells her preschool class all the time that she has been in environmental science and technology. And I don't think they're nearly as impressed as they should be. But basically, if you kind of zoom in on this figure here on slide 23, this is individual urine concentrations in this population, and they're mapped with the number of infant products in the home. And you can see I've added a line on here where we have sort of the average exposure in the PEN population. What you'll notice right away is that a number of babies in this study had much higher levels of exposure than pregnant women. And so we were sort of interested in this, how that exposure might be either confounding or sort of relating with their exposure during pregnancy and potential impacts on growth. I'm moving to slide 24. Excuse me. To really evaluate this hypothesis in a sufficiently large population, we launched the Toddler's Exposure to Semi-Volatile Organic Compounds in Indoor Environment Study, or TESSE study. And this study, you can see, we recruited children of mothers that were participating in a pregnancy cohort study here in North Carolina. We were hoping to get these kids when they were toddlers, but as you can see, by the time we enrolled them in the TESSE study, they were between 3 and 6 years of age, so a little bit older. We went to each of these children's homes and measured their height and weight. And then we asked children to provide 3 urine samples over a 48-hour period. And in those samples, we pooled them into a single sample and measured these OPFR metabolites. Slide 25 gives some information about what we found in terms of associations between these compounds and BMI percentiles. I've highlighted here IPPPP, and you can see when you compare children with the highest levels of urinary IPP, they tended to have BMI percentiles that were higher on average than those in the lowest percentile. So we saw about a 14% increase in BMI percentile in the highest exposed children. So in general, for other PFR metabolites, we didn't really see any interesting associations. The directions of association for these other compounds we're sort of back and forth, but there does seem to be something going on here with this IPPPP compound, both in terms of the fact that we saw associations with that compound and gestational length and birth weight among girls, and then among these sort of early elementary school age children, we also see associations between the current level of that compound in their urine and their BMI percentile. So we're doing a lot of work right now to sort of understand what might be driving that trend. And I have a conclusion slide, 26. Exposure to these PFR compounds is really common. It's quite variable. There are a limited number of factors that have been associated with increased levels of exposure. Prenatal exposure has been linked to lower birth weight in animals, and I'll just say that we can't really study this gestational timing piece in animals because rodent models don't make a very good model of preterm birth. So rats and mice don't have preterm babies. Prenatal exposure to BDC, IPP, and IPPPP may be associated with shorter gestation in girls, and we seem to see sort of an opposite pattern for some of these compounds in boys, with some really interesting differences in the potential health impacts of these compounds depending on the sex of the baby. Our data indicate that the long-term impacts of perinatal exposure, that's still sort of unclear, but our data do suggest that some of these exposures may be correlated with children's early growth and BMI, and in particular IPPPP. So I also just like to acknowledge and thank a number of people who participated in this work. In particular, I'd like to recognize Heather Stapleton, who is the PI of the TESSE study here at Duke and analyzed all the urine samples actually for both of the studies that I focused on today, and also Julie Daniels, who is at UNC and was the PI of the PIN Kids study. And finally, I'd just like to acknowledge the participants of both the PIN and TESSE studies and our funding, which was derived from a number of different NIEHS and EPA projects. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you so much. And I just want to remind our participants that there will be an opportunity for your questions towards the end of the call, so hold on to those. Now, I'm happy to introduce and welcome our next speaker, whose research focuses on consumer product testing, and whose work is an important contribution to raising consumer awareness to achieve health protective policies. Jeff Gearhart is Research Director for Ecology Center's HealthyStuff.org. Jeff has worked for over 20 years on a range of environmental issues, including air quality, pollution prevention, life cycle assessment, consumer product testing, and green chemistry. For the past 16 years, Jeff has worked with the Ecology Center, where he has spearheaded numerous chemicals policy market campaigns, pioneered citizen science in the use of X-ray fluorescence technology for toxics testing in products, and importantly, developed the now internationally recognized HealthyStuff.org product chemistry disclosure project. Healthy Stuff's extensive website includes advocacy resources and product testing results for more than 100,000 products. Jeff has co-authored or authored 15 studies on toxic chemicals in products, most recently a study of chemicals in carpets, and also the study he will be discussing today, Hidden Hazards, Flame Retardants, and PFAS in Children's Car Seats. Jeff holds a Master of Science in Environmental Science from the University of Michigan. And welcome, Jeff. We're so happy that you could be with us here today, and you may go ahead and begin.
Thanks, Diana, and thanks, Kate, for the really nice presentation. We started working on car seats over a decade ago, and many of us know car seats are one of the mandatory products that every parent has to purchase for their child if you want to take your child in a car, if you want to transport your child. So it's always been a priority for us to look at this product and look at the composition of the product. What I'm going to talk about today is mostly a case study on how the emerging science, some of which Kate talked about, public concern about these chemicals and regulatory focus on these chemicals has really helped change how car seats are designed and built, and we hope we'll be heading towards car seats that actually do not have these flame retardants in them. So if you take anything away from my talk, I want to emphasize that that through innovative material engineering, it is possible to design and build these products without the use of flame retardants, and thereby reducing this slice of exposure that our children get to these chemicals. I'll highlight there's 3 companies already on the market that have flame retardant-free car seats. There's many other companies that are in the process of rolling out flame retardant-free car seats. So I think this is, we're hoping within the next few years, this is going to be a success story on both the scientific and public health and policy side. I will, because I won't go into a lot of detail on the actual findings of the study. There is, on healthystuff.org, there's a detailed data file for each of the seats we tested and shows each of the chemistries we identified. So for folks who would like to dig in deeper, I will direct you there. Slide 2. And again, just as Diana mentioned, a broader orientation to our project, we work on a wide variety of consumer products and a wide variety of chemistries. Flame retardants is just one of them. But one of the common aspects of our work and why we think this is important from a consumer perspective and a market perspective is we do name names in terms of the products we test, the brands, and the individual products. So having that transparency so that consumers can actually understand what they're purchasing and make educated decisions is part of the work we do. So we'll go to slide 3. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've been looking at car seats for over a decade, and over that time, our methods we've used to analyze car seat components and this have evolved. To today, we're doing pretty much all of the sophisticated analytical techniques that researchers can use, GCLC, and also we've started to do fluorine chemistry analysis for PFAS and stain treatments. So the work has really evolved, as has I think the impact of the work. One of the case studies we always cite is Britax as a company. Early on, we had textiles that were on the Britax seats that actually had lead-based stabilizers in them, in addition to a range of brominated and chlorinated chemistry flame retardants. And that shifted over just a few years to a better product that had actually a chemical policy that the company was using to support that. So just to give you a sense that there has been a long timeline of work here. So I go to slide 4. I want to just give you a sense of that timeline before I talk a little bit about the 2018 study. We've seen, well, first to clarify is we do test all the components in these seats. So if it's a very simple seat, we may test only 5 or 10 components. We have some seats that have a wide variety of textiles, foams, and we may test 30 or more components on the seat. So we do a complete teardown of the products we test and look at all the components. So when you see tables on trends here, what we're talking about is components in seats. So what we've seen in terms of brominated flame retardant usage is it appears that we're still seeing an increase of the bromine chemistries in fabrics. We do see it in the foams. I think we're seeing it less often, but the fabrics, we're still seeing consistent use there. On the rigid foams, so the PU foams would be the soft foams. Rigid foams are going to be polystyrene or polypropylene-based rigid foams. That's where we're seeing HBCD consistently showing up, and most of the decline in the HBCD use that we've identified has been because of a material shift from polystyrene-based rigid foams to polypropylene-based rigid foams, which can pass flammability standards without the use of flame retardants. And then I just, in terms of 2018 study, what we were seeing in terms of brominated flame retardants was DB, DPE, HBCD, TBBPA, and TBC were the ones that we saw this last year. Plus, we continue to see brominated polystyrene showing up in these samples. Next slide, which is 5, shows the trends, and this relates to Kate's discussion regarding the organophosphorus flame retardants. As we've seen a decline in the halogenated, we've seen an increased use in both polyurethane foam and fabric of phosphorus-based flame retardants. The list here shows the flame retardants that were common between our 2016 and 2018 study. We also saw several other additional flame retardants in the 2018 study. TPHP and DHP were new flame retardants that we saw in the 2018 study. I would highlight the cyclic phosphonate esters. We had been seeing those for a couple of years. This year, working with Marta Veneer, who we co-authored a peer-reviewed paper on this, we were able to identify those as there's chemical structure there down below there for these, and we're calling them PMMP, 3 M's, 2 P's, and we saw those in a third of the textiles. A third of the car seats textiles had these flame retardants, and to our knowledge, this is the first time that particular phosphorus flame retardant has been specifically identified in consumer products. And importantly, on that flame retardant is we were unable to find very little experimental data on toxicity. So we have a big question about that flame retardant. Next slide, which is 6. So just quickly on the study design, we tested 18 seats. All the seats were from pretty much the last year and a half. The brands we tested are listed there. We attempt to test the most common popular brands. We do not get all the brands, and some of the products, we had a few products we tested that went off the market midstream when we were testing. So that was the general study design. Slide 7. As I mentioned earlier, we tested between 9 and 31 components in each seat. Our methods included doing our in-house work, which included infrared spectroscopy and XRF, and then working with, again, our partner at Indiana University Lab, Marta Veneer, and Graham Peasley at Notre Dame did our fluorinated chemistry screening for PFAS in the textiles. Next slide, 8. The highlights of the study were that, yes, we do have new FR-free seats, including the Nuna Metabolite, the Uppa Baby seat, and Kleck seats using their Mammoth fabric. And this has been an emerging trend over the last 2 or 3 years. As I mentioned earlier, we know of a number of companies that are also looking at rolling out new seats. Most of the other seats, 15 of the other 18, still contain 1 or more flame retardants. We know that some of the chemistries they should be out of, they're out of, so we don't see the PBDEs and any other chlorinated chemicals. For the first time this year, we're seeing actual data on PFAS use in the textiles, 50% of the seats. But the point I want to make on the presentation here is that because we've asked the industry to remove these chemicals, there's been a renewed focus on redesigning seats that can actually eliminate FRs as well as PFAS. So that's great. I'm going to hold talking about the federal regulatory issues so we can continue. Slide 9. One of the things we do is we try to provide a simple guide to consumers as to how to assess data on the products we test. This is an example of what we did on this project, where we have levels of concern: low, moderate, and high. The lowest concern products are ones that have no flame retardants. No halogens, nor organophosphates were detected in the seat through any of the methods we used, and we have 3 seats that fit those categories. And then we have 2 other categories that are gradated by the flame retardant chemistries we found, and then how many components in the seat they were in. There's more detail on this on our webpage. Slide 10 presents our overall rankings graphic that we produced as part of this. So you'll see the groupings of the specific seats into these areas of concern. The F's on the seat indicate seats that had PFAS stain resistance on the fabrics. And then in addition to this, as I mentioned, we do provide the full detailed data spreadsheet on all the sampling so that you can see the actual numbers and the chemistries that are behind these methods. These next two slides I'm mostly going to skip. So 11 and 12 are for you to take a look at to actually see that level of detail. So it includes the seat name, whether or not there was PFAS on the fabric, and then a summary of the results. So that'll give you a sense of where did we see flame retardants, in what types of materials, and what were the flame retardants. So this is a quick way for you to take a look and see what's in each of the seed, and it kind of gives you a good sense of how we did these groupings in terms of level of concern, and so you can take a look at that. So now I'll move forward to slide 13. So I mentioned we did a environmental science technology letter on this. Our key finding as part of that, there were a number of them, but one of them was a third of the seat fabrics contain up to 4% by weight this PMMP, cyclic phosphate flame retardant. And we are seeing that more and more in their textiles. So I think it's another continuing evolution of more of these phosphate flame retardants showing up in consumer products. If folks are interested in this paper, I can help get you a copy of it as well. And then quickly on slide 14, we are working with NHTSA. The flammability in car seats are regulated under a NHTSA flammability standard. We're working with car seat companies and other interested parties to try to get this standard amended to either exempt car seats or have a flammability standard that's appropriate to children's products apply to car seats. That would actually make and accelerate the transition of car seats to flammability-free fabrics and foams. So there's ongoing work there. If folks are interested in that, you can contact me. And so my final thing is I wanted to highlight some of the design changes. So on slide 15, there's two nearly identical seats from one company. This is the Nuna Pippa and the Nuna Pippa Lite. And one of the interesting things is looking at the price difference, and we spend a fair amount of time trying to figure this out, and it's difficult, but here's an example of where we have a $50 price premium to go from a car seat that has 3 different phosphate-based flame retardants to one where flammability compliance is achieved through innovative fabric design. So this is the type of shift that we're seeing in the market. I think it's a really good example of what these companies can do when they focus on more sustainably achieving safety requirements and then taking the easy out and using flame retardants. So how they do this, just 2 more quick slides. Slide 16, wool and polyester wool blends. I think many folks are probably familiar that wool is an inherently low flammability material, has a number of characteristics that allow it to be both as wool and then as a polyester wool blend. 2 of the seats that were flame retardant free this year used a polyester wool blend or pure wool seat cover. So that's one of the approaches. Slide 17 is I wanted to talk a little bit about fabric structure and flammability. And one of the things we've learned in talking with fabric companies and car seat companies is that the fabric weight, air permeability, the density of the weave, all changes the characteristics of these fabrics in terms of flammability. So if you actually go back and say, we need to engineer a fabric to pass a standard, you can modify the design of that fabric without the use of added chemical flame retardants to do that. And that is what the seed I mentioned earlier, the Nuna Pippa, or the Nuna Pippa Lite, excuse me, that's how they achieved that. And we know that there's a number of other companies looking at rolling out fabrics. And then slide 18, the last one is just some detail on that. So, and this is from a paper where they looked at fabric structure and flammability properties. And what they've showed is that the ignition time of the fabric is directly correlated with the crack time, and crack time in fabrics is the time in which, when it's heated, that the fabric actually cracks apart. And then when you look at, so that's figure 3 here. Figure 5 next to it is the dependence of crack time on weave factor. So when you look, and weave factor relates to all of these issues related to density, the amount of air spaces, all of those things in the fabric. So these are just a few tables to show that we can, and companies are modifying the fabrics based on these factors to actually increase ignition time and then be able to comply with the 302 standard that car seats are regulated to. So I wanted to just really emphasize that this is possible. Companies are doing it, and we're getting better products that are healthier. I would just, on my acknowledgement page on 19, want to thank the whole team at Indiana University. Marta Veneer, Notre Dame, Agilent Technologies helped us identify a couple of the flame retardants we hadn't seen before, and then our Ecology Center team. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Again, we will have time for discussion in just a few minutes. But before that, I'd like to invite Pam Miller to tell us about the ordinance that the Anchorage Assembly is considering that would protect the health of children and firefighters from exposure to harmful flame retardants. Pam Miller is Executive Director of Alaska Community Action on Toxics and co-chair of the International POPs Elimination Network. And you did receive a copy of the Municipality of Anchorage Ordinance as part of the materials that I sent out earlier. Welcome, Pam.
Thank you, Diana, and thanks, Kate and Jeff, for your excellent presentations and important work. So here's a short update on our progress in Alaska concerning flame retardant policies. We are very pleased that the Anchorage Municipal Assembly will hold public hearing on an ordinance. The number is AO 2915 to protect the health of children and firefighters, and that's coming up on Tuesday evening, February 12th. This ordinance really takes a class approach to preventing harm to public health and the health of firefighters, and would specifically prevent the sale and distribution of children's products and furniture that contain halogenated, organophosphorus, organonitrogen, or nanoscale flame retardant chemicals. And we're very grateful in this for the leadership of Assembly Chair Eric Croft and Assembly members Suzanne LaFrance and Forrest Dunbar in sponsoring the ordinance. The ordinance is very similar to successfully passed ordinances, the successful ordinance passed in the city of San Francisco and state legislation that was passed in California in 2018. This measure has the support of firefighters, healthcare providers, and community councils. And if you live in Anchorage, we hope that you will send a message to our Assembly members and, if possible, attend the public hearing on Tuesday, February 12th. At the state level, very briefly, we have House Bill 27, the Toxic Free Firefighters and Children Act, which was introduced as a pre-filed bill on January 11th, 2019, by Representative Gearhart. This bill also takes a class approach to phasing out harmful flame retardants in children's products and furniture, and is substantively similar to the Anchorage Ordinance. And we're hoping that passage of the Anchorage Ordinance will serve as a springboard to the passage of statewide legislation, which we've been working on for many years now. And we are also very appreciative of Representative Tarr's leadership on this issue. Today, I just want to make a note that the Safer States Coalition, of which ACAT is a member, released an analysis of policies currently being considered by state and local governments to fill the regulatory gaps left by the federal government. And we feel that these are necessary to protect public health from exposure to toxic chemicals. This analysis found that at least 28 states will consider more than 100 policies to require companies to disclose what is in their products, as well as limit exposures to toxic chemicals, including bans on PFAS in food packaging and firefighting foam, as well as bans on toxic flame retardants. So we've noted that really, as the federal EPA falters and drags its feet, it's more important and incumbent upon local and state governments to take action. And these governments are really on the front lines protecting citizens from exposures to toxic chemicals by enacting strong policies. Since 2003, more than 35 states have adopted 182 policies that establish state chemicals programs, limit or ban the use of harmful chemicals in products, and these include baby bottles, furniture, electronics, and a number of other products. So really, because of the gap at the federal level, it is really important, and we're very happy to see this action happening in our own city, as well as at the state level in many other states around the country. Thank you.
Thanks, Pam. We have about 10 minutes for discussion and your questions, so I'd like to invite participants. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please press *2 to unmute your line. Please also state your name and affiliation, and when you're finished, if you could please press *2 again to mute your line so we don't end up with a lot of background noise by the end of the call.
Hi, this is Patty.
Hi, go ahead.
Hi, this is Patty. I have a question for Jeff. I guess I'm a little slow on the uptake. Could you please re-explain what crack time is and what its significance is for flame retardancy?
Yeah, I will attempt to. I am not an expert at it. I'm learning as I go, but yeah, and I can send you a photo. It's basically what occurs right before the ignition of the fabric. It basically, the fabric separate. It's kind of like ripping. It's literally it cracks as it's heated, and this is done as part of a test platform, so they can measure that, and there's a number of studies that have found that to be more, at least for textiles, a better measure than just ignition. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Again, *2 to unmute your line if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment.
Hi, this is Joe Charbonnet at the Green Science Policy Institute. I actually had a question for both of the speakers. So first off, for Dr. Hoffman, thank you very much for your talk. You alluded briefly to the idea that especially the organophosphates get used as both flame retardants and plasticizers. And I was wondering if you had any sense of how much exposure comes from each respective use. And then my question for Jeff is around the use of booster seats, which are, from my understanding, of similar composition, but maybe the occupants of the booster seats have less hand-to-mouth behaviors than the occupants of infant car seats. But I wonder if there's been any movement on similarly removing flame retardants from booster seats. Thanks.
Thank you for your question.
So I guess I'll say first, I think my answer will be pretty short in that, yes, a lot of these organophosphate compounds can also be used as plasticizers. And in particular, we see that triphenyl phosphate is used in just a ton of different applications, including, we've done some work looking at it being used as an ingredient in nail polish. And so certainly it's used in these other applications. We don't know, we spend a lot of time measuring what's detected in house dust, and we certainly find these compounds in house dust, and they're significantly associated with what we find in biomonitoring samples from the inhabitants of homes, but we don't know how exactly it's getting into the dust. So it could be that it's from flame retardants in products, and it could be from other uses where you're, sort of getting similar breakdown of plastic products. I think my sense is that more of the exposure to these compounds is coming from flame retardants, and that's particularly true because not all of them are used as plasticizers. So like the TDC IPP or chlorinated tris wouldn't be used as a plasticizer. So for that, certainly more of the exposure is coming from flame retardant applications.
Just real quick, just in terms of booster seats, they're made with the same materials that are used in infant and convertible seats, and we have tested them before, and you see the same types of chemistry show up there. But yeah, you're right. You have kids moving to less hand-to-mouth kind of behavior there. The one difference is the booster seats are less complex. So the seats we've seen with more complexity, you increase the opportunity for suppliers to introduce more different flame retardant chemistries into the product. So which is why we've focused more on the infant convertible market because of the complexity of the products.
Thank you. We probably have time for one or two more questions. *2 to unmute your line.
Hi, this is Lisa Jenkins. I work for Chemical Watch, and I was just wondering if it would be possible to repeat the names of the two bills, the one in Anchorage and then the one on the state level.
The ordinance in Anchorage that will be considered at the upcoming public hearing on February 12th is AO-2019-15. And the state bill that was introduced by Representative Tarr is House Bill 27. And I'd be happy to send more information if you'd like.
Thank you.
Just now unmuting. Yeah, more information would be great. Thank you so much.
Sure, you're welcome.
All right, one more question or comment? Well, if there are no other questions, we want to remind you that this call has been recorded. You will be receiving an announcement tomorrow when it is posted to our website, and I will also include a link to the Safer States analysis that Pam referred to about the 28 states that are considering more than 100 policies to require companies to disclose what's in their products. And I want to thank all of you again for participating today, and thank our speakers for joining us. Please consider making a donation to Alaska Community Action on Toxics to support our monthly Che Alaska calls, and your contribution of just $5 or $10 a month will help provide the support we need to continue bringing you these calls throughout the year. You can give online at akaction.org. Again, thank you to everyone who participated today, and look for those emails from me tomorrow. Thanks again to everyone, and have a wonderful day.